So thanks a lot. Thanks for having me today for this new edition. So yeah, we're going to talk about documentation, and more specifically, what I'd like to call the legendary fountain of truth by componentizing the documentation. So the first thing is that documentation for your project, whatever it is definitely a success key. You could work on a really brilliant project, but if your documentation is lacking, and if you're missing important part in it, nobody will know how to use your project or to use your library, your project, your app, your document, whatever you want. So you do have to stay focused and stay really strong on your documentation. But it's not always that easy, because when we talk about documenting code, our code often desync from our documentation because we're writing some example, but we can't maintain or sustain our documentation in time and keep it in sync with the rest of the code base, because no one likes to write documentation. I don't like to write documentation, and you probably don't like that too. So we need to find a way to embed the rest of our teammates, especially developers, in this process to write advanced documentation that could be stay in sync with the rest of your code base. So we need a single source of truth that we need to edit once and to have it available everywhere in our documentation and in our code base. So the fact is, right now we are more and more changing the way we're developing and working on new apps and new content, and we entered in the component-driven development era. So why working on component at first? The first reason is that it improves the development process, because it's faster to develop a component at once rather than working on an overall application. It's simple to maintain, it's better for reusability, it helps you to write good tests and advanced tests. It helps a lot of people to just understand the way each part of your application is working and how to improve just a single part, a single button, or a single piece of your interface. And it's better for the rest of your system. So because we have those code bases that are components oriented, we should probably work with them and embed them directly in our documentation to keep it in sync with the rest of the document. So this is where MDX is entering on stage. So right now, your documentation is probably written in Markdown or something like that, because it's just easier to write rather than working on HTML, because it's just a syntactic sugar in it with a few elements to tag your component. So it's easy to read, easy to contribute for the rest of your team and your contributors and your teammates. Everybody could write a Markdown file. It's really easy. But the problem is it's too simple to write an advanced documentation, especially if you want to have some kind of advanced example right embedded in your documentation. So we are now using, or we want to use the MDX syntax. So MDX syntax is no more than having JSX right available in your Markdown files, which means that I have a Markdown, I can add some kind of components in it. I still stick on my standard Markdown flavor, but this Markdown file is converted to a JSX AST, and this JSX is then converted to HTML. So I could write content like just importing components, write in my Markdown file, put those components the same way I could write HTML directly in my my Markdown, but having the advantage of using my document and my components directly in my Markdown files. So it's a big improvement if you want to embed some content in it. You have different way to embed the components right in your documents. The first one is probably looking for naked stacks, like I don't know, any static site generator like Gatsby or Next.js or React statics file or whatever you need. You could embed the MDX interpreter right in those generators. So it's really flexible, but it's not really documentation oriented. So you have to develop everything that you need for your own project to be ready to embed your own code and your own elements right in your documentation. On the other side, we have some kind of component documentation oriented frameworks like Storybook with MDX in supporting their pages, or Dogsy or something like that. There is more constraint because there are documentation frameworks, but you have the advantage of using playgrounds and props table and so on in it. So it's totally related to you and your project and what you want to use. Do you want flexibility, but on naked solution, or advanced solutions that are embedding everything for you? The main piece of the main takeaway of this talk is probably you have to stay focused on the organization of your project. This is a screenshot of Backlight, which is a design system editor we're working on at my company. But the interesting thing with it is that rather than working on an overall documentation for the whole project, we are specifically focusing on each component. So each component embed its own code along its own stories, its own tests, and its own documentation by itself, which means that you document each component in an isolated way, and you could have top components on them, like an introduction components or use case components that help you to point to the different part of your application. But each part of your interface, your application, each component is embedding its own documentation by itself. So how to improve the way to write your documentation with MDX right now? The problem is MDX is too low level. It allows you to embed components right in your Markdown file, but that's all. So we need an advanced way to use this power. And this is where Playground's magic enters stage. With it, you just write once your code, you embed it directly in a Playground component, which is a wrapper that allows you to render the result of your component and the code use and the different variants. Like you could write a series of stories for your component, you could do that directly in a Playground. So in your final documentation, you will embed a whole placeholder, with all your component in it and the different code that you will use to put it in front and to embed it in your final application. You could also use props tables that are reflecting the content of your component to present the different variants and the different properties available on your component, allowing you to explain for your user and demonstrate how to use each properties, how to play with them. So you could easily have an example, live example, directly in your documentation. So finally, we're going to coding our final documentation, because we now have a format that allows us to import the component and the elements that we want to document directly from our code base. We could put some explanation and some text content to help people to understand and gather the whole way and the whole information on how the component is working. And then we could directly put some advanced playgrounds or description on prop tables and so on for the dedicated component we are currently documenting. So we could reflect everything from the code and extract the content from the code, like we extract content from JSDoc comments directly. So finally, our code is just a template that we could iterate with our code base directly to have a live documentation in it. So migrating from an existing code content, an existing code base to MDX is pretty much easy, because your documentation is probably already in a Markdown format. So it's just taking your existing Markdown files and putting some advanced playgrounds and props table and description components in it, but that's all. You have to organize your documentation in a component way. So split probably your documentation and gather every part of your documentation along the code directly. You have to make your choice and pick the right tool. Probably you want to use a documentation-oriented framework, but you could also use a naked solution or a doc platform if you want. but choose the right tool for you. And then you could start to play with your embed component in your documentation right now. The fun fact is that MDX is just paving the way. This is really nice if you want to use some kind of advanced JSX component, like a React component or something like that. But if you're focusing on something more abstracted, we have another format that is called MDJS, and MDJS is doing exactly the same thing, except it's doing it by using existing code blocks in Markdown, but specifying the destination of the code block. So you could add a description like, this is a script and I want to import my component, or this is a preview story, or this is a story, or this is, I don't know, whatever you want. There is a lot of definition. So if you are working on a JSX application, JSX format, then stay focused on MDX. But if you want something more abstracted and more JavaScript compliant, then MDJS is definitely what you are looking for. Just keep in mind that writing documentation outside of writing the code, it's totally nonsense. You do have to write them in the same way and keep them in sync at all. And stay focused on advanced tools rather than reinventing the wheel each time. So thank you very much. That's all for me. I'm Mads. I'm Principal Developer Advocate at DevRelCon, where we are baking a lot of dev tools dedicated to components. So that's why I'm here for you. Thanks for everything. Thanks for having me again.